I found myself standing in a room that was probably 20 by 20. In the middle of this room, where all the windows had been broken out, was a large, probably 10-foot tall steel, looked like a solid steel structure. I had no idea, honestly, what I was looking at. I stood and I walked around it a little bit, and I was trying to put together all the pieces. And then a little kid ran in the room, was startled because I was standing there, and he ran back out of the room. I stood there for a few more minutes, and then I followed him out, and I found our guide, our driver, the guy that had brought us there. I was in Sierra Leone, Africa. And through an interpreter, I began to ask him, what was it that I was looking at? And over the next couple of minutes, he tells me, well, that's the remains of a large, huge diesel engine. And that diesel engine would pump water from a well into a water tower that I couldn't find, I didn't see. And that water tower would then distribute water to the people in the village where we were visiting. And I said, where's the water tower? And he said, it's gone. And I said, what happened to the pump? Because that engine, I don't even see a pump, I just see the engine. And he began to tell me the story of how these men had come into their village and they began to harm their women and their children, executed many of the men that were there, that everyone just scattered and ran off into the bush. And then over the course of a week, they completely disassembled this diesel engine, taking every part that they could take. The only thing they left was the engine block. And then before they left, they broke down the water tower, and then they ripped up the pipes for about a half mile in every direction from the water tower. They actually weren't even interested in the scrap metal. They wanted to make sure that this village never had water, and these people died. A couple years before that, I found myself in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, standing in front of a picture that you've probably seen, the capital of Haiti. The Capitol building split almost in half from an earthquake. And I stood there in front of this chain link fence, and as I stood in front of the chain link fence, I noticed there were blankets everywhere. And as we all stood, because we had only been in the country for about an hour, and this was one of the first places they took us, as we stood there, we're all taking pictures, and I realized I'm standing not in front of a chain link fence, I'm standing on someone's bed, because that's where they were living, because they had no home and they were fearful of another earthquake. Found myself in Panama, touring the Panama Canal on a trip. The place where we stayed was in the middle of the city. It was incredible, some of the biggest skyscrapers I'd seen in my life, because all of the trade, the international trade that comes through the Panama Canal, fills and lines the pockets of the people living there. And we spent 3 days just about a mile from the largest skyscraper in the entire country, because it's the largest slum in Panama, less than a mile from there. Found myself walking into the nursing home as quickly as I could, trying to get to the room that I needed to get to, and as I got there, I realized I was too late, because there in the bed was a World War II double amputee who had just passed minutes before I got there, and his family stood at his bed weeping. In that moment, they were tears, and I was confused, because it was tears of sorrow, but also tears of joy as they celebrated his life, but they were grieving deeply. I stood in a cemetery next to a mom who, as the graveside service ended, just looked at me and said, "What do I do now?" Because her son had died at the age of 10 and had spent all of his entire life either in her arms or in a wheelchair, in and out of hospitals, so many doctors. And she said, I don't know what to do tomorrow. I've spent so much of my life caring for him. What do I do now? And then there's the moments that all of us have shared together. 9/11. Now January 6th. Hurricanes. So many wildfires, so many things that we've seen that have unfolded on the news, and now they give warnings. The images you're about to see are disturbing. We are all experiencing those together, and I stand back in those moments, and honestly, whether it's sitting in Africa or whether I'm sitting in my living room, I stand back and go, God, what do I do? What do I do with this? What do I do with this? And it's actually the very nature of the series that we're in, because what we're seeing, everything that I just described, and those are mine. You've got your own. Some of them happen to you. Some of you witnessed. We've all got them. It's the image of paradise lost. That God had a plan and intention, and it is not the picture that we see standing in front of us. And it creates this conflict. What do we do with this? What do I do? Which is why we're calling this series Paradise Lost. We're looking for lessons that we can learn from the book of Genesis. God, if we open your word tells us it's going to give us instruction, it's going to give us correction, it's going to give us encouragement. What happens when we open your word? Can we make some sense of this? Are there lessons that we can learn from Genesis? Today we're going to look at the pattern of creation. Denny set up, a couple weeks ago, set up this entire series looking at creation. And then last week, Todd talked about kind of those first days of creation, and God creates this beauty and wonder in nature, and we see it all around us. Today, we're going to get to day 6 of creation, where we show up, where man and woman show up. The order of creation looks like this. Days 1 through 5 go like this. God said, he speaks something into place. He speaks something into being, and then he says, that was good. And then day 2, God speaks something into existence and says, wow, that was good. And we see that pattern in creation. God speaks on day 3, creates something, says, that was good. Day 4, I'm doing this on purpose. Day 4, God speaks, creates something, says, that was good. Day 5, God speaks, creates something, and says, that was good. Day 6, God speaks. He creates the animals, and the animals begin to populate the earth, and then the pattern of creation is disrupted. There's a pattern. We're like, oh, this is very predictable. I know what's going to happen next. Pump the brakes. That's not what happens next. If you look in Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, he begins to create all of the animals. He creates them, and we expect him to say, that was good. And then what he says next, we pick up in verse 26. Then God said, then he says, so he disrupts the pattern. Then God says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the seas and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all of the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. It's the pattern of creation. It's disrupted because God says, let's make man in our image. Now, look at the person sitting next to you. If there's anyone near you, okay, because there's not, if you're at home, look at the person next to you, okay, and say, you're made in the image of God. Say it, go for it, go for it. See, I hesitated to say that in here this morning, just so you know, like the place is packed if you're at home, so I want you to know. I hesitate to say that. But we are made in God's image. We are his image bearers. We are the disruption in creation. There is an order, and God says this and this. He says it, and he creates it. He says it, and he creates it. And then we disrupt the pattern because God says, let's do something unique in creation. And we're created in God's image. Goes on. It says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Does it sound like I'm repeating myself? When you read that really fast, let me do it again. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. When we see patterns of Scripture that repeat themselves, we need to recognize there's something there for us. It's there for us to learn something. And right here, what it's saying is we, men, women, children, we are made in the image of God. Here's my first question this morning. Are we treating one another as if we are made in the image of God? When I wrote that question down this week, I had to think about it myself, and I experienced a little conviction. It made me think, who am I not treating as if they're made in the image of God? I experienced some conviction, and I began to think, okay, now what do I do with this? The creation story goes on. Verse 28. God blessed them. So God blessed man and woman, and then he gives them a job. He says, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And then God said, I'm going to give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, and they will be yours for food. And to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky and the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their vast array. And by the seventh day, God had finished the work that he'd been doing, and on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. There's a pattern of creation, and then it's disrupted. When God says, I'm going to create man and woman, and they're going to be different. They're going to be special. In all of my creation, they're going to be unique. And then I'm going to let them steward and manage all of it, including each other. I'm going to give them responsibility to steward and manage one another and their relationships with one another and how they treat one another. That is a stewardship. We often talk in church, and I'm sorry we've done this, and I've been a victim of this, and I've probably caused this. When we talk about stewardship, a lot of times when we do that in church, we're talking about money. But in this context, God is saying, steward everything. I'm giving you everything, including one another, to manage. So here's the second question. How are we managing one another? Are we caring well for one another? Regardless of what part of the garden we grew up in, what we look like, what side of the neighborhood we live on, what side of the street we live on, what side of the aisle we live on. How are we doing at managing and stewarding God's creation in one another, who were created special, unique, a disruption to the pattern? So much so that after God created man and woman, he was like, woof, I'm going to take a break. Completely disrupts the pattern. Ends it, 7, the number in the Bible, it means complete perfection. It was like, that's it. My grand finale. People care for one another. I had an instance a long time ago, now that I think about it. My oldest is 18, and we were with some friends, and he was probably 3 or 4, and we were playing on this indoor playground at the mall, back when you could play on indoor playgrounds at the mall, and there we were, and this kid, I have no idea who he was, but these kids are all playing around. This one kid I noticed starts picking on my kid. I don't know who this kid is, but my son's climbing on the top of this plastic turtle. He's about 3. And this other kid at the top is sitting, and he puts his foot up like this as my son's climbing. You know where this is going. And he's going to kick my son down the plastic turtle. I'd like to say that little boy lived. No, I'm just teasing. I didn't do anything to him, but I'm just telling you what. I came up out of my seat, and you better believe I gave him that dad look like, I see you. And I don't know where your parents are, but I'm going to find them, and it's not going to be good, right? Because there was something in me. Like, you're going to go after my kid? No, you're not. I don't care if you're 4 years old. No. I had a thought this morning. If I ran into God in the lobby, this is hypothetical, okay? If God's walking through the lobby, and I'm like, hey, good to see you this morning. Did you have trouble getting here? I don't know what I would say to him. But, I see God in the lobby. I'm like, hey, do you have any pictures of your kids? I wonder what that moment would be like. God pulls out his phone. He's like, oh, let me show you my kids. And he begins to show me pictures of his kids. And I'm like, okay, oh my gosh, how many kids do you have? All of them? All of them. How are we treating God's kids? All of them. Because they're his. There's a pattern of creation, but are we stewarding it and managing it well? Are we managing how we treat others well? There's a pattern in creation. There's also a pattern in the life of Jesus. And we see it in Jesus' largest collection of teachings. We find it in Matthew chapter 5 and 6. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And you should go read it this week, Matthew chapter 5 and chapter 6. There's a section of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus gets into this rhythm, this pattern, where he says, you have heard it said. He'll give an Old Testament reference. He'll give it a picture of the Torah, the law. You've heard it said this, but I say. You have heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, don't murder. I say you look at someone with anger, that's murder. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I'm saying you look at a woman lustfully, that's adultery. You've heard it said, I say. You've heard it said, I say. There's this pattern that he does. And just guess how many times he does it. 6. And on the 6th time, he deviates from the pattern. The first 5 times he says, you've heard it said, but I say. He's quoting the law. Time number 6, he disrupts the pattern. He says, let's not even talk about the law for just a second. You've gone so far out of the law. You've heard it said. You guys have made up your own laws. He says, but I say, love people, honor them, respect them. Don't follow the ways of the world. Break the pattern. It's a theme that we see in the Old Testament, the New Testament, that there is a created way in which we are supposed to act and respond that God has set us up to do. And we go outside of that, and then he has to enter into the picture. He has to break the pattern to give instruction, wisdom, care, sometimes encouragement, sometimes correction. The rhythm of the pattern of Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount reminds me of the order of creation, that God created it perfect, and then we screw it up in the fall, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. And Jesus says, but you've heard it said, you guys have misinterpreted what I'm doing. Let me bring you back to this new way of thinking, which actually isn't new at all. It's just bringing us back to the very beginning and how it was intended. What if we interrupted the pattern of today's culture like Jesus was asking us to? Like Jesus was telling us to? What if we did that? When I was a kid, my sister is 5 years younger, and we tell the story probably every year when we get together. I would sit in the other room and I would watch my sister. She'd be in the other room watching TV, and I would hear her talking, and I would inevitably go out. I'm like, who in the world is she talking to? And I would walk into the other room, and I would see her sitting about 3 feet from the television talking to the TV. Yes. Yes, I do. Uh-huh. Yeah. Just talking to like it's like there was a person in the room. And there wasn't a person in the room. There was a person on the television. His name was Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers would look at my sister and say, do you know you're special? Yes. Yes, I do. Do you know that there's no one like you? Yes. Yes, I do. And we kind of make fun of her now because she would talk like she thought he lived in that little box in our living room. And so that's why we joke about it and we laugh about it. But Mr. Rogers did that not just with my sister, he did that with thousands and thousands and thousands of little kids. He spoke truth into their life. He gave them encouragement. He disrupted the patterns of the chaos of their life. And if you read about the people that would come to him and thank him and talk to him, they would say, you were the only stable figure in my life. Which is why it's no surprise that when the terror attacks happened on 9/11, that PBS called Fred Rogers, even though he had been retired for several years, they called him and said, Mr. Rogers, would you please speak to the hearts of not just kids now, but of these grown men and women that you spoke into their life who now have kids of their own? Would you give them some encouragement? Would you give them some word that we can put on the air, some way to make sense of everything that we're seeing? Mr. Rogers reluctantly agreed. He sat down in the studio, and when you look at the raw footage of that moment, there was no script. You see him struggling, not sure what I'm going to say. He pauses, and then he says, okay, I've got it. And he speaks directly into the camera, directly into the lives and into the hearts of these children, now grown adults. And rather than reading you his words on just these moments after 9/11, I want you to see what he spoke into the hearts of these adults and these kids.
No matter what our particular job, especially in our world today, we all are called to be tikkun olam, repairers of creation. Thank you for whatever you do, wherever you are, to bring joy and light and hope and faith and pardon and love to your neighbor and to yourself.
No matter who you are, no matter what you do, you are called to be repairers of creation. The word tikkun olam is a Hebrew word. And if you were Jewish, you would know the concept of tikkun olam. I didn't know it. I watched the video a couple weeks ago and it struck me. And as I began to read more, it's this idea that God has created something beautiful. And to the Jewish people, they had a role in restoring and repairing creation. And that day when Fred Rogers looked into the camera and says, no matter who you are, no matter what you do, we're called to be tikkun olam, repairers of creation. He was speaking to everyone who was trying to make sense of that moment that was outside, completely outside, contrasting the garden image of creation when God created man and woman, after he created animals and separated the oceans from the sky and created all the green plants and creation. As we watched those towers crumble, he speaks into us ancient words that we are to be repairers of creation. I believe it's what Jesus was saying, a new pattern for us, that we're called to be tikkun olam. Especially as followers of Jesus, our role is to be tikkun olam, repairers of creation. One of the things that Fred Rogers would do often was he would spend time with people. He would challenge them. Take just 30 seconds before I leave your company. Would you take just 30 seconds and think about the people that have helped make you who you are? He would do that very regularly. I kind of want to borrow from Mr. Rogers this morning and tweak that just a little bit. I'm going to give us 30 seconds in the room just to sit and listen, not to our own thoughts, but just to listen to the Holy Spirit. for him to reveal to us where we need to be a repairer of creation. Is it in our home, our workplace? Is it online? Is it with our keyboard or our thumbs? Where is it that we need to be a repairer of creation? And I'll not create the list, because then you'll just go, oh yeah, that's one. I'll just let the Holy Spirit in these 30 seconds just speak to us. So let's do that together. That morning I had stood in that room and seen that engine block that had been left there simply because it was too heavy. But later that day, I stood in a village and I grabbed the handle. It's called on what's called an Indian Mark II water pump. It's the classic pump that you see, the hand pump that you see throughout all of Africa. And I began to pump up and down this pump, and water began to flow, and all of these little African boys and girls surrounded this pump, and they put their hands under this crystal clear water, and they began to splash it over their faces and throw it in the air because they'd never seen water that clean. And that Indian Mark II pump was there because some people in the United States decided we need to be repairers of creation. And they heard the story and they began to put water wells in Sierra Leone, Africa. And to this date, they've put over 150 wells there in Africa. They're repairing creation, restoring it. I stood in Honduras just a couple years ago. I got to go with World Compassion Network. And I got to spend time there. And you know those plastic food boxes that we pack here in our community? Those bins that we put some rice and some beans and some things in. I got to stand there and I got to hand those out. And I got to be a part of watching these people's faces as they walk through a line and grab some clothes and grab some things and then grab a Bible, some of them for the first time in their own language. And then they got to take one of these boxes that you all had packed. And I saw the joy in their faces because you're repairers of creation when you engage in things like that. With Pastor Roger, I got to spend a day with Pastor Roger and go through La Carosa and meet the teenagers and the young men and women that they're investing in. And I got to see their agriculture projects and the pigs that they're raising and the chickens that they sell. I got to see that, and what I was experiencing and seeing in front of me was repairers of creation, repairing creation and bringing God's order back to life. I got to stand and make bricks with a guy. I can't even remember his name, but we stood and made bricks in the hot sun in Haiti. After I had seen the devastation of the Capitol building, I got to figure out how do they make these bricks, and they were building a school to educate the kids of Haiti through a ministry called Jesus in Haiti because they're bringing Jesus to Haiti. I've seen so many of those stories of repairers of creation, and we have a role to play in that. And I believe the Holy Spirit whispered something to you today. And it may not be fund a water well. It may not be build a building. It may just be make a phone call or send a text. But we have the chance and the opportunity to be repairers of creation today. And maybe not just the opportunity, maybe the responsibility. God, I love you. Lord, thank you for who you are. Thank you that we get to be a part of what you're doing to repair creation. God, move in us. Help us to have the courage to do something with the image, the person, the thought that you gave us today. To be repairers of creation. I love you, and so in your name I pray. Amen. So for those of you that are watching online, I want to turn it back over to our online host. They've got a few words that they want to share with you.
What an awesome service today. It's amazing. I love the challenge. Where can I be a repairer of creation?
Yeah, that's right.
You know, who is God calling me to? And just the reminder that we are created in the image of God.
That image of God thing, in seminary we talked about all the time, Imago Dei, and people wrote books about this. And I think it's safe to say it's not just like maybe a physical appearance of God, but God gives us a responsibility being created in that image. It says something about the Lord, it says something about us, and for our part, I think there's a sense of responsibility that we have that Scott addressed the entire time there.
Yeah.
How are we repairing that? How are we becoming the tikkun olam of creation? I think that's a wonderful sort of like reminder, like you said, that we are called to be fixers. We have to be able to go out into the world, look at the situation that we have, and become as God was, you know, a creator, and in that creation, we sort of share that image with other people.
Yeah.
I loved the cohesion of worship today, where we kind of sang about all the creation sings holy, all the creation sings worthy. We're created to worship God, and I think worshiping God comes in that being repairers too.
So good. Yep. We are image bearers. I love it.
Yeah.
All right, you guys have an awesome day. I hope you get to get outside and enjoy some fun in the snow.
Absolutely.
Thank
yeah.
you so much for joining us. Have a great day.